Hello, and welcome to Module 9. My name's Sally Thorne. I teach here at UBC over next door in the School of Nursing, and I have a long-standing enthusiasm for applied qualitative methods in the health sciences. Some of my roles include being associate editor of the journal Qualitative Health Research, and I also edit a journal in nursing that deals with critical ideas in health and health policy. And I've been working for some time on applied qualitative methods, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. In Module 8, you will have had a grounding in some of the important social science traditions that we draw on in the qualitative health world. Each of them was designed for the needs of a particular intellectual project in the social sciences, and it has methodological technique that is closely structured toward the intellectual reasoning of those disciplines and the knowledge products that it's trying to create. The technique that's been developed is a goldmine of wonderful resources we use in the applied health world. But what you may find, and many people have found, is that strictly adhering to the methods of the original methods of those qualitative techniques can really create a kind of rule-bound sort of research that follows through and appears to follow logically, but actually produces bloodless findings. There has been a tremendous critique about this methodological rigidity, following through on what you think is right because it's there in the guidebook, but not being able to generate findings that actually make sense toward the intellectual project that you're aiming for. And in the clinical world, we really are trying to look at the kinds of problems that we see clinically and that we recognize as relevant because of the nature of our work. And so there really is an intellectual logic that drives the kinds of questions we ask and the kinds of answers we want to be able to discover, which is a little bit different than social theorizing. So it's that I'm going to be talking to you about today. Clinical epistemology really is quite a different form of reasoning than is either a straight sense of truth and a sense of a material reality, or a subjective experiential kind of idea that that's the only truth. We operate in the world in which both exists. Truth exists and it doesn't. People experience, and the kinds of knowledge we're generating have to do with pattern recognition, which we do clinically, but also infinite variation on pattern. We never teach clinicians to assume that because they've seen something several times that means that that's all they will see. They always have their mind open for this variation. And so there are some very important distinctions between a clinical epistemology and the kinds of philosophical and theoretical worldviews that have generated those original methods. And that's what explains some of the variation that we'll talk about today. The applied qualitative methodology tradition is evolving to try and help guide the design logic that draws on this wonderful technique, but actually creates the kinds of studies that are going to be useful to answer the research questions that clinicians have and the clinical sciences have. They attend to the idea that the disciplinary orientation that you have informs your sense of why a question is a relevant question to ask. And that the conceptual structure with which you organize ideas to understand a phenomenon is what guides the research, rather than some artificially selected theoretical framework or positioning. And we generate qualitative studies, particularly to fill in pieces of puzzles, to be able to flesh out our knowledge in a way that's going to be relevant to the clinical science of a discipline, whether we're studying clinicians or patients. We're recognizing that there are species of knowledge that are inherently missed in traditional measurement and quantification techniques, that there are aspects of science that can't be uncovered and understood, and that we're aiming our studies specifically toward those relevant ideas. So in that context, it's important to think about what constitutes data. What are we actually going for? And I know that many of you will be thinking about studies that have to do with either semi-structured or in-depth interviews or focus groups. Those are the most usual forms of qualitative research that we use in the health field. But I did want to point out that there's a limitless possibility of what actually constitutes data and what's usefully thought about as data. Many studies increasingly are considering multiple different sources, because each source has its implications, its strengths and its limitations, and sometimes triangulating those sources and gathering things from interviews in which you've had an influence on the shape of what gets surfaced, and textual materials in which you haven't had an influence, for example, can be quite useful. So reflecting on what constitutes data and recognizing that this data is a representation of the realities that you're trying to capture. They're all different kinds of representations, and understanding the nature of that is quite helpful. Then within the decision that you've made about what constitutes data, your next moving forward is sort of saying, what are the data sources? Where am I going to find it? The qualitative tradition has often looked at the horse's mouth, which is sort of the metaphoric representation of getting as close as you can to the idea of the actual experience. We, of course, can't tap into actual experience. We can only tap into the representation of it by knowing and engaging with people, hearing and listening to what it is that they express. And so very often interview, some kind of conversational context, has been the primary data source that many qualitative researchers have tended to. Of course, it has its limits, as you can imagine, because we only can articulate that which is accessible to us intellectually or consciously, and we don't necessarily have the capacity to put into language all of those aspects of experience that may be relevant to a phenomenon. So from the point of view of data sources, it's worth thinking about some of those other kinds of sources beyond interviews, including observation and including expert opinion, which is in fact a clinician who's seen many people will have listened perhaps to many cases and will have had the capacity to reflect on them. So limiting ourselves just to talking to patients, for example, is not necessarily the only way to be doing a great study. Sampling is another important part of a qualitative design. How do we figure out which cases we're going to draw in? Often qualitative studies are small samples, and that's reflecting the value of some kind of in-depth, intensive engagement, often going back and back, being more informed by the nature of questions and digging deeper, extrapolating, expanding, clarifying, and trying to truly understand. Depending on the nature of the question, though, deeply understanding a small handful of cases may not be the best way to answer your question, and having a less in-depth kind of understanding of multiple cases may be useful. There's also theoretical reasons to sample. It might be quite appropriate to simply talk to the first 6 or 8 people of a particular type that you run across, but it may also be that either for strategic reasons, if you're studying breast cancer experience, you might want to look at post and premenopausal women, for example. You may have theoretical reasons to start with, but you may also evolve some ideas from the analysis as it evolves, as you begin to understand that perhaps this would be an important variation that you need to attend to. You may want to theoretically sample for cases that might represent those key diversities that that could help inform you about your study. So to be aware that there are multiple forms of sampling, but again, you're trying to find a sampling strategy that meets the logic of what you're trying to discover. Sample size, there is never a fixed rule with regard to sample size in qualitative research. Often the studies are bounded by virtue of your time and capacity, the resources and the access that you have to people, but they will be smaller where there's a more intensive, in-depth, kind of subjective, nuanced experience to be harvested, and perhaps larger where you're looking to represent more diversity and more variation within your sample. The work of constructing data is not simply doing interviews and gathering interviews, but recognizing that the researcher is engaged very much in the generation of what comes to constitute data. Beyond asking a research question, your ethics approval process will require that you articulate usually your initial trigger questions for the initial interview. And this is a requirement to make clear that you've put some thinking into what it is that you're going to ask. But it doesn't need to represent a fixed, structured interview as much as some general categories of where you might launch. And the expectation in a good qualitative study is very often that your questions will evolve and become more refined as you have a deeper understanding of a phenomenon, so that you might have initial questions to launch you into the territory that you want to go, but some collections of prompts and cues and elaborating kinds of questions. As you're engaging with your data collection, though, you're already beginning from the very outset to compare and contrast and to reflect on other instances that you've learned about and heard about. So this idea of constant comparative analysis is a very useful one. Although it's specific to grounded theory methodology, it really is useful for all qualitative research. You don't simply gather and then analyze. It's an iterative process throughout. Because data collection in this context is quite loose, there is no natural endpoint. There's nothing that will come up and a bell will ring and say you know enough. The theoretical literature and qualitative methodology often talks about theoretical saturation, when you've reached enough to fully understand all of the categories. That idea comes from the social sciences, in which it may actually be relevant to say that. In the clinical world, we wouldn't tell a young clinician to say, having seen 20 cases of this phenomenon, you can feel fairly confident that the next case you see will be exactly the same. We are always oriented toward the idea that there will be inevitable variation in all we see clinically. So the notion of theoretical saturation actually doesn't work to help you get out and to conclude. And you may need to simply be able to say, I have now seen and interpreted enough to be able to say something relevant about this particular phenomenon. But it won't ever be the be-all and end-all. And this kind of knowledge is always a work in process and something evolving. In terms of handling data, very often we use audio tape recording, sometimes videotape recording, and transcribing that, because it renders those interview experiences into a textual format. It isn't essential that one transcribes, and that notes can be quite useful as well, although if you're note-taking during an interview, you can find yourself distracted by those notes. Transcription is a good way of recording and being able to bring back to recall the sensations and experience and the questions you were having during the interview process. It isn't, though, with much of what we do, essential that every be timed and every single detail of the recording in a technical way be captured, because it really is very often the essence of what people are talking about, the nature of their experiences and accounts. So transcription can be done in various ways. You always need to be thinking about data storage, organizing, and sorting. And of course, in the health world, we're obviously extremely concerned about identifying features. Not simply the name and the location or the disease of the patient, but often the information about the clinic that they were at or the clinicians that they were sorting through. So being aware of issues of making sure that your data are secure and appropriately handled. The analysis process, which actually begins as soon as you start data collection, is really all about making sense of data. This is what I see. What does it mean? And in the health world, we're always drawn by that question of what does it mean? Qualitative research classically is guided by inductive reasoning as opposed to deductive reasoning. We're not simply starting with a paradigm, generating predictions and creating an experiment to prove that or to test it out, but we're looking at the large world of data and building generalizations on the basis of that. So the analysis process is not simply looking for fit, but looking for possibility and examining that broad sense and saying what might be happening here, what might be some links between these observations that I'm making. And that process of inductive reasoning is what moves us into being able to create coherent findings. Useful to just be aware of and remind yourself of that distinction. The data analysis process is a complex one. It involves many parts of your brain thinking simultaneously. You're striving to find the knowable and then moving beyond the self-evident of what you see and hear into the question of what it might mean. engaging those mechanisms of interpretation, and also envisioning what that research product might look like, striving towards something that has those qualities of a coherent conclusion. You'll be aware that there's lots of guidance for coding and sorting. Traditional methodology often points you to an open kind of initial coding that becomes more refined over time as you develop a really coherent sense of theorizing. But recognizing that most of the qualitative research we are doing in health is not for the purpose of theorizing, but much more for the purpose of better understanding phenomena. You may not want to go too far into formal coding, and that's certainly not required to be able to generate a coherent product. Coding is a form of organizing, and it's attaching a language signifier to a particular phenomenon that you have begun to identify so that you can track and organize other cases of it and ask questions. All of coding is for the purpose of stimulating this constant comparative analysis. It's not because the nature of the code itself is providing something. And in fact, you may want to be very cautious about prematurely using a language signifier that may suggest you already think you understand what something means. You might call it category A, for example, or the yellow category, just so that you can communicate to yourself that there's a link between ideas, but without prematurely concluding what the nature of that link could be. You may be aware that there's lots of different available software that can be specifically helpful to qualitative research. And I want to caution you about the use of software, particularly in an initial project. It can do lots of indexing and sorting and organizing, has lots of bells and whistles, and can seem very appealing. Important to remember that it does not do analyzing. Inductive analyzing only goes on in the mind of the researcher. It's purely an organizing structure. The downside of it is that you can invest quite a lot of time and energy into organizing your software management structure and get quite intellectually exhausted to the point where the initial coding is as far as you want to go. You're not really able to undo what you've done and take that conceptualization forward. So what we have available on an ordinary computer these days is plenty often to do the organizing and sorting that you need. And there is no, in a smaller study, no obligation to use software techniques. So even though they're popular, be aware that there are cautions toward them. They are simply fancier ways of doing the organizing and sorting. That really is the work of the mind of the analyst. As you record things in a format, you want to make sure that you don't forget the logic that you were using. The logic is the important part of being able to reconstruct and to create an audit trail around that analysis. Coding and conceptualizing is all for the purpose of making order out of the chaos that you're seeing. And I say chaos because there's data are so complex and interesting, ideally, that order does need to be generated. And the order that you make should be guided by the point of your inductive reasoning in the first place. What's the nature of the question, and what's the nature of the kind of answer that might be useful toward that? So I'm really encouraging you to control that coding. Coding can be pretty addictive, and you need to be able to use coding as a technique to get to where you want to think, not as an endpoint. Moving forward with your analysis, you're trying to use these intellectual processes to confirm the bases on which you think you are seeing what you're seeing, to expand on those associations, beginning testing out those relationships perhaps, but also capitalizing on the outliers. Why is this one different than these others? Sometimes even the outliers you don't see. As a clinician, I can imagine there could be a situation in which this isn't the case. So you're engaging the critic in your mind. You're coming from an informed perspective on the basis of your disciplinary knowledge that will cause you to reflect on why I'm seeing what I'm seeing and what it might mean. These processes of organizing and sorting help you test out the structures that you need to be able to generate. You've got to take some interesting conceptual ideas that you've been developing and rework and organize them into some kind of logical structure that you can actually begin to write about. And in order to do that, you may find yourself envisioning that final analytic product. Many of us have listened to qualitative research and read findings, and we tend to have a visual image of a Venn diagram or some kind of visual representation that we imagine our research will look like. Be aware that you can be trapped by thinking that you should represent it in a particular way, and that there are many, many different displays. The display is dependent on the nature of the message that you're trying to convey. The ideas that you want to generate may not be a logical phased diagram or equal components of something. So think about different ways of a display as a way of organizing your thinking, but not getting trapped into that. It's also important to recognize that the outcome of qualitative research is not any one entity. The outcome of good qualitative research doesn't always look the same. Some are very exploratory thematic surveys. I see three preliminary themes in the thing that I'm studying. Many of us would imagine that it's going to be a much more coherent conceptual description, or even an interpretive explanation, a very solid, coherent way of thinking about a phenomenon quite differently. But not all studies lend themselves toward that. Smaller studies may only be amenable to a thematic survey, and that may be useful. So recognizing that with qualitative data, there are many different kinds of qualitative products that you might need to look at, and try and make sure that you're matching the nature of the qualitative product with the depth and detail and level of analysis that you've actually been able to achieve, so that there's a good link between those. From the point of organizing, often qualitatively people have been good at thinking about visual and graphic displays and linkages, but it's important to recognize that you do actually need to translate what you write into an organizing structure. And the good old-fashioned table of contents is an excellent way to do this, to think about major and minor subheadings, creating the syntax and grammatical form that will help you be able to make a decision about where's the beginning and what is the natural sequence of how we organize the information that will allow the development of the logic trail that got me to the place of the understandings that I now have, that I can now translate to another person. And so the linkage and transitions of that inductive reasoning are manifest in the organization and structure of a table of contents. And when you can do that, you often know that you're really ready to write up those findings. In the clinical world, we're rarely simply describing something. We describe things so that we can understand them. There's always a so what for those of us who engage in qualitative research from a clinical perspective. So you're interested in what interpretations can I make of this? How does this fit in the context of what other people have thought or not thought? And where will I take this idea? You're aware that generalization is a mathematical property that can be worked out from the findings of studies of many quantitative kinds of research. But of course, the qualitative world doesn't operate in a mathematical formula perspective. At the same time, there are ideas that have a philosophical generalization quality, and there are criteria by which research can be considered credible. Qualitative research has credibility measures. So it's important to be able to think about those interpretations of your findings and ensuring you're expressing those interpretations in a way that add to the credibility of the logic that you've been demonstrating. Qualitative research is really designed in our world to be countering the limits of conventional science and capturing certain kinds of experiential phenomena that aren't easily captured through numbers and measurement, exposing patterns in experience, categorizing commonalities and variations, and then helping us expand that critical reflection on context. The explicit contribution that qualitative science brings is to contribute that which other forms of science either miss or misunderstand. And when you deconstruct the measurement that goes on in your particular world, you'll be able to identify where those possibilities exist. that which defies quantification. There's lots of human experience that cannot usefully be measured and quantified. Things that behave in ways that can't be regularized, and also very much those aspects of human experience that change when they're taken outside of their natural complexity. Qualitative research has the capacity to capture things within the context of its natural complexity in a way that's quite useful to develop a clinical imagination. The kinds of interpretive credibility that you want to attain for your research are to bring it to being a corrective to the inherent limits of measurement and generalization. So as you discuss your findings, to be able to link it with how we know what we know through other methods is a very important credibility measure. It's important that we think of it as well as a gap filler. It's a place that we can generate knowledge that fills the gap between what we understand through other techniques. As an illuminator, something that sheds light on a particular shadow aspect of an experience that can flesh out and enliven our understanding through other means. It's very much a variance interpreter. With small studies, we may not see huge samples. We begin to understand what are the qualities and variations that help us see the human diversity that we experience. We can see things have some commonalities, but what explains and helps us understand and look for those differences? You can easily imagine that kind of research as guiding clinical wisdom. We use this kind of research to challenge commonly held ideas, scientific or otherwise, and to humanize phenomena, to help people understand that human aspect of going through a particular experience. So strategically designing your method, the method by which you gather data, collect data, analyze your data, interpret your data, is what will make the difference in making it intelligent science and science that is taken up by the world in which you operate. So in qualitative health research, we're not just theorizing or trying to compete with quantitative studies to attain a better position on the evidence hierarchy, but we're really working toward integrating and synthesizing ideas so that we really have a rich and coherent knowledge for application. And as a final slide, I've provided a few more resources for you as you think about this idea of applying qualitative methods, not specifically necessarily from the conventional sources, but in the way that's going to best serve the research questions that you've derived from your awareness of the important issues that are going on in your clinical practice. It's been great talking to you, and all the best with your research enterprises.